Silent Hill is very divisive as a franchise. You have a lot of people that only love the original Team Silent titles, aka the first 4 games in the series. A lot of people that only accept the original 3 games and shun the rest. And people that seem to appreciate most, if not all, of the titles, including the post-Team Silent games. There might be other divisions I'm looking over, but those are the major ones. I've made it no mystery about how I felt when the franchise had to keep going on without Team Silent. I passively commented about how I did not find these later games palatable. However, it's been such a long time since even looking at these games honestly. It really got me thinking if they are as bad as I remembered. I have not played any of the Western Silent Hill games since shortly after they launched. The original 4 titles had such a unique vibe. They were each pretty scary and enticing in their own ways, moments that would claw into my brain as a teenager in ways I couldn't describe. Creeped out was putting it mildly. The original 4 games still leave me with a feeling of pure content to this day. I didn't get this feeling at all with the games that followed Silent Hill 4. However, I figured it was time I give them a fair shot once again. I think it's worth looking over them now, as these days I try my best to enjoy what games offer even if they're not that great overall. I'll also be breaking this topic into 3 separate chapters. First, a general coverage of these Western attempts to succeed the original Silent Hill games. Second is exploring the topic of inspiration and what it means to follow up the original establishment of this franchise. And after that will be a look at where the series stands now, or as I like to call it, the poisoned well. With all that said, let's begin. Less than 2 years after Silent Hill 4's release, Konami officially announced the first original handheld game in the series, Silent Hill Origins for the PSP by Climax Studios, introducing itself with a little teaser. Unfortunately, this would be the most interesting imagery to come out of the game, and all of these Western efforts for that matter. I like this kind of stuff. It reminds me of the music videos the old developers made for some of the previous games. Silent Hill Origins itself is not nearly as creative. From what I understand, that teaser I like so much was done by a completely different division of Climax Studios located in California, and the original developers set to make this game. That division ended up getting liquidated while a European team went scorched earth on the project, starting production over, hitting PSP at the end of 2007 but ported to PS2 a few months later. While I understand it has a few hiccups in performance and such, it appears to provide the same experience. It's not a Hero's Paradise abomination, I can tell you that much. The game itself is considerably underwhelming. The story of Travis Grady plays everything very straight, leaving little to no mystique for his background, and you see the twists in the story coming a mile away. How the game tries to tie his background with the original game is messy at best and insulting at worst.
They can't do anything for her. She just sits there. She wants her boy so badly.
Who are you talking about? Is the girl inside? Alessa? Is Alessa in there?
No. No! You know who's in there!
Prequels are such a touchy subject for me. They always seem to have a hard time justifying their very existence, and something like Silent Hill definitely didn't need one in this form. A book or graphic novel depicting the very beginnings of the spiritual power residing in Silent Hill, or perhaps the cult that would end up corrupting said power. Sure, I'm willing to give something like that a chance, but trying to depict it as yet another horror game similar to the first 3 just doesn't seem right. That's ignoring the fact that they messed up just about the entire cast of the original game, most notably Alessa herself, which, spoilers, the idea of her being a source of evil raining terror upon the town is a bait and switch when you play the original game. So her being depicted as this generic ass evil little girl summoning monsters and shit is just ridiculous. Even the people in charge of the franchise during this time agreed this depiction was a bad take. Although, regarding presentation, it isn't that bad for a PSP game. I can see they wanted to make this feel more like the original 3 titles for the most part. The dynamic camera angles tend to look pretty good, and I think it's fair to say at least some of the environments were mildly interesting, tackling new kinds of venues like the theater and motel. A big problem though, the environment is way too dark. This game could have used a dynamic lighting system similar to the original game. Still, that wouldn't have helped the lack of imagery throughout. Even in the Nightmare counterpart, there's still little to see besides blood and rust. Regarding gameplay, the controls aren't very good. For one thing, you need to hold square to run, but you gotta keep it held down for what feels like a full second before Travis actually starts running. If square was used for literally anything else, that would be more understandable, but it isn't. Not while you're free to walk, that is. Also, 3D tank controls aren't an option at all. I know a lot of people don't like tank controls, but it's pretty important for the original 3 Silent Hill games because of how drastic the camera changes can be. If it weren't for tank controls in those original games, you'll get disoriented nearly every time the camera shifts. I know that because that's what kept happening to me now with this game. I know Silent Hill 4 didn't have tank controls either, but that game did not use the dynamic camera angles nearly as much as the previous games. It was a much more basic camera most of the time, so it never really proved to be a problem. The developers of Origins wanted to bring back those really dynamic angles, which is obviously fine, but to ignore the original control scheme that helped them make sense? And don't even think of blaming the PSP's button layout for this. Silent Hill 1 can be played without 2 analog sticks just fine. Core mechanics range between tedious and boring. You got enemies that grapple you into QTE scenarios where as long as you hit the 2 buttons correctly, you get away unscathed. Seeing the same animation for these over and over gets tiring. Breakable weapons are another useless mechanic. I never even came close to running out, but it did prove to be a nuisance when they'd break, leaving me to my fists at that very moment. However, I realized the enemies have a huge dependency on the flashlight, so I ended up skipping a lot of fights. Keep it turned off and you can whiz by nearly all of the monsters without a care in the world. The puzzles weren't anything special either. More often than not, they felt like busy work with a couple equations. Silent Hill Origins doesn't really provide a satisfying experience, especially for those that wanted to learn more about what happened before Harry's escapades to save his daughter, because all it does is muddle or reiterate old information.
You were at the fire. I saw you there.
Of course you did. That was my house, burning. My daughter, Alessa. You were the one who saved her.
Yeah. She was your daughter? Why did you leave her? Why did no one help?
I imagine some people might think it'll be a good idea to start the series with this title since that's the chronological order, but doing that potentially ruins the experience of the original game with information and setups that just don't fit, while also ruining a handful of the characters involved.
We've received no new patients in the last day or so. Was she hurt?
She was burned all over.
Are you a relative? What did you say her name was?
I don't know her name. I was the one who saved her from the fire. She must have been brought here. Is there another hospital?
I'm sorry. Perhaps someone in reception could help you. I have urgent business to attend to. I'm surprised to see you. We had assumed you'd just leave. Well, time to put her pawn to sleep. Good night.
You've done a great deal in a small time span. You've done so well, in fact, that I've received some interesting offers for your services. Ordinarily, I wouldn't contemplate them, but these are extraordinary times.
Next, Konami would attempt a more legitimate continuation, and I'd imagine they considered it a big deal since it would be the first Silent Hill game for the 7th generation of home consoles, developed by a new company that's a hodgepodge of various groups, Double Helix. Silent Hill Homecoming is terrible. What a fun way to open this up, huh? Not underwhelming, not meh, it's awful. I hated it in 2008 when I was a dumb teenager, and I hate it even more as a dumb adult who has half of an idea when it comes to enjoyable video game design. I like to think I've become a less hateful person. Angry YouTuber is definitely something I toyed with when it came to shit like Hardcore Uprising and Dead Rising 4 back in the good old days, but I think it's more fun and progressive to admire the positives of a game even if the whole experience itself isn't that great. But for Homecoming, there is nothing positive. Absolutely nothing. Just looking at this bullshit makes me scowl. The atmosphere is either insanely bland or insanely garish. This noise filter they slapped over the screen looks so ugly. The third-person camera is uninspired and makes Alex take up the center of the screen and obscures so much of the view. The amount of stupid jump scares are just obnoxious. The combat is so terrible that even video guides online look like they're just exploiting bad AI. The puzzles are shit. All the character models look like hideous mush, and the narrative is complete garbage. It especially sucks because the premise is actually kind of interesting. A man returning from service dealing with his neglectful family that emotionally abused him as a child? Sounds intriguing enough, I'm in, but it does very little with that concept as Alex just chases his brother around for most of the game. We see some imagery here and there, but it feels more shallow than, say, the notes from the forest and the water prison in Silent Hill 4. The most we see is the scenario that blatantly rips off Jacob's Ladder. All around presentation is terrible too. The motion capture and face animations are so bad they shouldn't even have bothered.
I want to ask you about Scarlet. What's happened to her?
To mention her name. You're not as worthy as one hair on her head.
How on earth did games 7 years prior on a weaker system do so much better in these departments? I guess it helps when you give a shit. It just blows my mind how they thought this was a good direction to take Silent Hill, while in the same breath claiming they have a good idea of what the series is all about.
And once we did that, we actually cut it into a video, put some of Akira's music to it, and said, we think we understand Silent Hill and this is what we're going to do with it. We felt confident about it.
When it comes to Origins, I can look at things like the enemy designs, the environments, and go, yeah, I can see what they were trying to go for. That's understandable. Even if I don't dig them, I get what they were trying to do, you know? But this shit? How the hell do they think this is what makes a good Silent Hill game? Bodies gored apart, drilling faces up, decapitation, beating real living people to death, and endless hallways of boring rust. I understand Silent Hill 1 through 4 had some dead bodies or disfigured depictions of such, but 90% of the time they were heavily obscured, and much more importantly, they were never the focus of the game. Even the act of killing someone in the old titles was pretty tame. The boss fights at least have a semblance of strategy put into their design, compared to the original games keeping it pretty simple where most of the cases were hit it until it dies, but Alex controls so horribly that these boss encounters are either unbearable or effortless. And you know what? Those are the two words I'll use to describe this game. It really boggles my mind that anyone can see anything good when it comes to Silent Hill Homecoming. This game was so bad that Japan didn't even want it. It's officially the Atomic Bomberman of the Silent Hill series.
You shit fuck!
Tired of this obnoxious gorefest? Well, Climax Studios, the same team behind Silent Hill Origins, released Silent Hill Shattered Memories about a year later. This was a special occasion since Konami wanted them to revisit the franchise's beginnings as a celebration of Silent Hill's 10th anniversary. Although Origins already did that, so In Silent Hill Shattered Memories, you explore a town that appears mostly abandoned, but I don't think that was what they intended. Rather, everyone's just shut away into their homes due to a major blizzard and suck at securing their places of business. Unlike any of the iterations before, Silent Hill is just a normal town that isn't abandoned. The exploration feels very formulaic, almost like an assembly line. Run around, hear annoying static to find a haunting or some shit. Use your phone, solve a puzzle, and look at all the stuff if you feel like it. And goddamn, the puzzles are only getting worse. Presentation all around is well done. It rightfully received accolades on how it was one of the best looking games on the system. Good details on the faces and many of the effects, especially the snow and ice. There's a lot of detail in the furnishings, and nearly every single room has new things for you to observe. The voice acting in general was fine, but nothing really memorable. I feel like a lot of them don't have much to work with because it just feels like they're acting for something more lighthearted most of the time.
That was elegant.
Lacking in finesse, but 10 for effort.
I don't think they fit the atmosphere of a psychological horror game. There's moments here and there that stand out.
Stop talking! You can't talk me out of this!
I'm not here to stop you. I pulled your file at the station. I told you that, right? If you're telling the truth, this doesn't make sense. But I think you are telling the truth. I believe you think you're Harry Mason. Hell, I believe you are Harry Mason. But Harry Mason was killed in a car crash 18 years ago. You want answers? I guess they're waiting in there.
But that's all they are, moments. If only they had a substantial story to take their acting ability with. I think the crux of why I don't enjoy Shattered Memories very much is the fact that it's supposed to be a revisiting of Silent Hill as a celebration of its anniversary. Let me explain what I mean by talking about the ending. You run, talk to some folks, look at some posters covered with impact font, and run. Thrust, vault, and swim your way to the end like you're training for the Olympics. Also, you can find out that the only thing that ever actually happened was a therapy session where an unknown character did some meaningless tasks so that the therapist can yell at you.
18 years of denial. A whole universe of fantasy in that thick skull of yours. A skull teeming with agents of repression. Blind children clutching photos in the dark.
Sidebar, this shit was so forced and feels like the writer and director were just struggling to get a reaction out of the player.
Fantasy dad propping up her make-believe with scraps of a happy life that never was, scraps of a father who never existed. Wake up!
This is very unprofessional therapy. Anyway, why the twist ending? Long story short, they basically got the idea for this one looking back at the original Silent Hill and its 4 main endings. Specifically, the game's worst ending, which has a twist where nothing actually happened. Harry died in the car crash during the introduction video. Back to Shattered Memories, there's no alternative. Harry's dead, always was before the game even started, so none of it ever actually happened. During therapy sessions, you're just playing as Cheryl and learn more about her past and I guess how she's dealing with her dad's death? All the meanwhile spoiling the twist with really obvious giveaways. What sense does it make of Harry going through all of Cheryl's memories like some spiritual avatar? If they wanted to play this it's all in her mind and none of this happened card, I think it'd make a lot more sense if you were just playing as her, getting through this turmoil while revisiting her past, as well as witnessing how she's coping with the loss of her own father. Not only do I think that would have made more sense for a story like this, but it would probably pack a lot more emotional impact. Actually, what I just described was literally Silent Hill 3, so never mind. What really makes the premise of Silent Hill even more worthless for this iteration is that they clearly aren't even using that ending from the first game. The occurrence and characters involved are completely different and the game has nothing to do with the town or the spiritual power residing in it. In fact, as far as the game is concerned, there is no spiritual power, there is no abandoned town, there's literally nothing that makes this Silent Hill. This is all just one big therapy session. Why did it use the Silent Hill name? The original pitch for the game was actually leaked a few years back, tentatively titled Silent Hill Cold Heart, and it sounded moderately more interesting. And hey, as far as I could tell from this pitch, it was actually going to be related to Silent Hill. Some elements did make it into the final product, such as the therapy sessions, but overall it seems like they were really going to push Wii's own gimmicks as well as hardware. Perhaps this is why nearly all of its aspects were dropped in Shattered Memories. Or it could have been due to an upcoming game known as Winter having a very similar concept. Although, just like Cold Heart, this game never came to be. Regarding Cold Heart, while it was going to be part of another made-up district, probably so the devs didn't have to sweat over destroying continuity like Origins and Homecoming already did, I like the idea of the corrupted spiritual power depicting a new kind of nightmare world. After all, according to what Silent Hill 2 established, everyone sees the nightmare in their own unique way.
It's hot as hell in here.
You see it too. For me, it's always like this.
Back to Shattered Memories. While the story itself is spotty at best, and I find the direction they took it to be somewhat offensive, you can tell the people involved worked hard on making the game a unique experience. I like the concept of psychological profiling, but it comes with very mixed results as it attempts to read the player. I understand the idea of the game was to take note of what caught your interest the most when it came to observing the areas, but I liked observing everything. I like to look in every nook and cranny in order to make sure I don't miss anything. This led Shattered Memories to thinking I'm a demented sex pervert because I looked at a single poster in the beginning of the game, and an alcoholic because I don't know why. I even filled out the form saying I don't drink to relax. What's funny is the game did a complete 180, analyzing me more than halfway through the story.
How would you like to die? No, wait, let me guess. You'd like to die having sex. You're obsessed with not having sex.
It's just so sloppy. The game deserves some praise. I don't hesitate to agree that it is one of the best looking Wii games in its entire library, and they give you heaps of things to observe. I just couldn't be intrigued in any of it. All of the everyday objects scattered around in these empty buildings are so ho-hum and don't add anything to the story. And most of the voicemails and text messages are so try-hard that they're embarrassing.
Power of mind over matter. I control my destiny. Death is an illusion. Death is a buzz.
Stack that with the story that doesn't really make sense and is entirely predictable. If only they didn't provide multiple dead giveaways before you're even halfway through the story. Maybe they expected me to just keep my brain turned off from beginning to end? I don't know. Silent Hill Shattered Memories is not interesting at all. It just tries really hard to convince you it is. The next game in the franchise would be teased about half a year later as Konami held a press conference during E3 of 2010, showing off various games, including the next mainline Silent Hill title for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360.
Silent Hill has helped shape what horror games are meant to be, so we're borrowing influences from what the successfully executed in the past. The disturbing creatures, the mind-boggling and mind-bending psychology that transports players to an alternative nightmare world.
This trailer for Silent Hill Downpour was absolutely repugnant. It just looked like some haunted house crap, and not the kind of haunted house crap, which wasn't really crap, from Silent Hill 4. How on earth did people take this seriously for even a second? However, throughout 2011, they shared more about the game and I thought it was starting to get interesting. They wanted to emphasize the idea of exploring the town itself, something that felt lacking in the series since Silent Hill 2. Was this game a triumphant return to absolute quality for the franchise? The review sphere averaged out to okay scores, and a good number of people were praising the game as a return to survival horror and a breath of fresh air for the Silent Hill franchise. 8 years of simmering, and a good number of people considered a valiant effort in recapturing the magic of the original titles. However, I can't really share that same sentiment. At the title screen, the game plays an embarrassing intro video that I think is trying to be more like the original Silent Hill's introduction videos, but a quick game of compare and contrast says more than enough. Sorry, Davis. Silent Hill Downpour by Vatra Games is this weird amalgamation between the Western titles they've been putting out since 2007, bringing back a lot of annoying mechanics like breakable weapons and peeking through doors. I'll give credit where it's due though, the game itself is filled with a surprising amount of content. If Silent Hill Downpour does anything well, it's giving the player a lot of different optional side missions. While not as fun as the more kooky extras found in the early Silent Hill games, it's still something that encourages replays, if you want to 100% the game, that is. Most of the side quests are just basic ghost stories and do nothing for me except laugh when I recognize a stock sound effect. Oh, but that's not entirely fair. Silent Hill 4 was full of these too. Still, the side missions have absolutely nothing to do with the town or the corrupted power residing in it, or the cult. Actually, nothing in this game has anything to do with those topics. This immediately rules out the idea of this sequel making any progress expanding the concept of the town or its history, which I guess is disappointing, but the last thing they came up with were ritual child sacrifices, so maybe this is for the better. And before people make the claim that Silent Hill 2 had just as little to do with the cult's corruption of spiritual power residing in the town, first of all, that isn't true. Second, Silent Hill 2 was able to provide a tired concept of a story in a brilliant and cohesive way from beginning to end, even without focusing on the cult. With that said, the story of Murphy Pendleton running around Silent Hill to fight his inner demons is really bad. While I'm definitely a fan of stories about a man having to kill the past, this just feels like a bland take on someone going through a set of purgatory-esque events and guilt trips, and once you dissect the game to its guts, you kind of realize how bullshitty the narrative is. Your choices throughout the game and a couple other statistics determine what ending you get, but they also determine your character's actual history before his trip to Silent Hill. It feels like the game has nearly nothing congruent or cohesive to say, and parts of the story just don't line up when Murphy's background decides to subvert your knowledge of it by basically retconning itself. Seeing how much can potentially change makes it completely fall apart and doesn't really make sense. I imagine some would argue that Silent Hill 1 did similar things with its story, considering how the endings can determine what did or didn't happen. And I'd agree with you. I'd also state that I'm very glad the games that followed did not do that at all, save for the joke endings. If Silent Hill 2 pulled the same crap as Downpour, for example, there would be times when, say, James never killed Mary, or Mary never even died and is actually waiting for him to come back. Again, weird crap like that works fine for post-game content that isn't meant to be taken seriously, but when it comes to presenting a single focused story, it's frustrating. Also, for the argument of Silent Hill 1, the third game stated clear as day what actually happened regarding the first game's canon. Back to Downpour, the presentation isn't doing it any favors either. Motion capture and face articulation are almost as bad as Homecoming. Most of the time, everyone looks very neutral and bored. I'm also convinced Anne's scowled look is baked onto the in-game model itself, because she always looks pissed off, even when she isn't.
I'm sorry.
Perhaps just a case of RBF. I wasn't a fan of how the town itself looked, or the furnishings. I kept noticing how often they reused assets in different areas, or sometimes the same areas. With some, I'll admit it's because I stared for too long, but other times it was so blatantly obvious they kept reusing the same pictures or objects. Sure, Silent Hill 3 borrowed some things from 2, and 4 from 3, but those were entirely different games between each other. When you make a lamp look good the first time, you don't really need to do it again the second. The sheer number of times Downpour recycles from its own assets is just embarrassing. Maybe it was okay in 2005 when Resident Evil 4 was reusing and mirroring assets everywhere, but even before that with Silent Hill, they kept it to an absolute minimum in order to make the entire game look unique from beginning to end. The Nightmare World scenarios looked fine for what they were going for, but the developers misunderstood what the point of that was to begin with. For all of the Silent Hill games, including the Western ones before this, the point of the Nightmare World transitions was to show a demented, corrupted version of the area you were just exploring. For Downpour, they're more like obstacle courses from hell. They almost feel like they belong in a completely unrelated game, so it's a lot less interesting to me as someone that wants to immerse himself into the world of Silent Hill. Also, the monster designs have reached an all-time low, some looking more like they belong in the Manhunt series. These prison goons and mummy ladies do absolutely nothing for me. At least they didn't try to just copy previous Silent Hill games, but this is quite a bad trade anyway. The gameplay isn't much to write home about either. Some of the puzzles were definitely okay, but I really missed the brain-teasing riddles that last appeared in the third title. There's one, just one, in Downpour, but at normal difficulty, it didn't demand a lot of thinking power, and hard difficulty, it just turned into bullshit. Combat is also cumbersome, but perhaps that's for the best. It's almost as understated as the combat in the first 3 games, so I appreciate that. While enemies like to randomly tank hits or get you in stun locks, fighting is still much more manageable than the garbage they threw at you in Homecoming. However, some instances are considerably feeble. Take the boogeyman here, for example. He shows up on occasion, really depicting a threatening aura, like a certain individual from an older game. But once it's showdown time, once you gotta face your fears, all it takes is baiting a whiff and getting a hit or two in. Rinse and repeat until he takes a knee, asking for a dick flattening. Not to say the Pyramid Head fights from Silent Hill 2 were these epic encounters, but this just makes Boogeyman seem especially pathetic. The controls in general have their own problems. The layout makes very little sense, and we're back to 2D movement. And just like Silent Hill Origins, they attempted to give us unique camera angles, but it causes disorientation in the middle of traveling, as expected. Also, they're much more static and less interesting this time around. So while they probably wanted to give us unique dynamic camera angles like Silent Hill, they just used basic security camera style angles like Resident Evil. Wrong game, guys. You copied the wrong game. It's probably the most diverse Silent Hill games these newer devs made. It actually tried to have variety regarding gameplay. I just think it falls short in many of its aspects, including how it tried to be scary. In a world where the original games had such subtle points of horror that really creeped into your mind in so many different ways, it's really offensive seeing what they came up with for Downpour. All the attempts they make to scare the player are just laughable. I'm glad they didn't try to startle and shock the player at every turn like Homecoming, but it's still not scary in the slightest. Murphy's dumbass scream cues don't help convince me either. Silent Hill Downpour isn't a horrible game by any real stretch. It just never excels in any department, both in regards to being a good new Silent Hill experience and an original horror game. As for the last fledgling attempt from Western teams to make a Silent Hill game, Book of Memories launched on PlayStation Vita in October of 2012. While the developers do their best trying to convince you it's focused on horror with some semblance to the previous Silent Hill games, it isn't. At all. It's an isometric game that can have up to 4 players running through rooms to kill monsters and find items to help you progress. Breakable weapons, stats, leveling up, and a bunch of other basic RPG dungeon crawling elements. This game would be handled by WayForward Entertainment, who have a pretty admirable library. Even some of their licensed games are impressive, so I'd be lying if I said their involvement didn't catch my interest. People within WayForward were tinkering with Silent Hill long before Book of Memories was even announced. Some developers took assets from games like Silent Hill 2 and 3 in order to create a demo for the Nintendo DS. A handheld port of the original games doesn't seem too far-fetched, considering games like Flower, Sun, and Rain, Resident Evil Deadly Silence, and later on Metal Gear Solid 3D. A low-poly Silent Hill 2 or 3 would have been fun to check out, at least out of morbid curiosity. You guys know I'm all about that. Of course, as time went on, they began fleshing out something that looked more original and closer to previous Silent Hill games. I mean, sure, it looked drab, but it's a work in progress. A mechanic I found interesting was the concept of panning the camera isometrically when in puzzle rooms, while the rest of the game utilized the more traditional camera. However, the final game would just have this isometric perspective from beginning to end for the most part. I actually don't have a lot to say about the game, except it is about as bad as a lot of people expected. Silent Hill Book of Memories is riddled with poor design, questionable presentation, and extremely tedious gameplay. However, I did play this extensively back when it was new. As I grew tired of barely working ports and Gravity Rush on my PlayStation Vita, I decided to bite the bullet, and kept on chewing. It's, not good. Oh, and funny enough, despite that the entire game is in this isometric camera angle that was originally intended for puzzle solving, the puzzles in this game, A, don't use that perspective at all, and B, are the worst puzzles in the series. I think at best, they can challenge the thinking power of a 4-year-old. What's a real shame is that WayForward obviously didn't want to make a bad game. I mean, I like to think that's always the case, but the thing is, the direction they were led to is what really tore down any possible potential it had. Apparently, Konami requested that this game use all of the Vita's features, including the touchscreen and rear touchpad. That left them with implementing mechanics that could have easily been mapped to buttons, making the gameplay even worse than it already was. But would removing these awkward inputs have saved the game? No, because Konami also said it has to be a multiplayer-focused experience and have a design that leads to an endless campaign. So beyond the main story, you just keep going through more and more stages that jumble up all the assets of the game into randomized layouts. Wanna play up to level 3000? Go ahead, I'll start writing your eulogy. Basically, whoever these executive jokers were that demanded the game be designed in this manner on the Vita is what led it to be such a blunderous game, especially considering this definitely ate away at their production time since they were basically making a completely different game before these demands. It was a doomed plan from the start, no matter how you look at it. YouTube group Twin Perfect did the most thorough analysis possible on this game in their channel, so take a gander at that sometime, as they look into other aspects I don't care for at all, such as the nonsensical story. I dare not ask how unnecessarily thorough this analysis is, but the whole thing clocks at about 2 hours, so you be the judge. Anyway, going over all of these Western teams' attempts to make a new and satisfying Silent Hill experience, I think this next aspect is very important to look into. So, why are these Western-developed Silent Hill games just not able to quite nail what made the original 4 games so special? Dare I say, can it be a cultural thing? They say real champagne is only made in France after all. Oh, Ghenry, that's so close-minded of you. Are you saying the older Silent Hill games were better just because they were Japanese? Not exactly, no. We had a Silent Hill game that was Japanese with a bad story before. But I think it's ridiculous to deny the cultural perspective it took to give such a unique spin on a horror experience. Team Silent's cultural background was certainly one of the ingredients, you know? Just like with Dead Rising, a big component to what made the original Silent Hill games interesting is that they were a Japanese take on Western horror. So when a Western team comes in and just provides their Western influence, I don't find it as charming. They tried to make Silent Hill 5 different times and failed. What else am I supposed to think? In preparation for this video, I started looking into the matter, trying to really get a scope on the idea of Western developers and Japanese developers tackling the same property, and why a lot of people, including myself, find that so appealing. Honestly, there's so much to discuss when it comes to this topic. Times when Japanese developers made awesome games based on Western IPs, times when they didn't, times when Western developers are able to make a great entry to a Japanese birth franchise, and of course, the complete opposite. It's honestly a lot to unpack. For now, let's focus on what I think was the ultimate divide between the developers who made the original 4 Silent Hill games and the people behind the rest, which is culture in horror. The developers of the original Silent Hill games took so much inspiration from many different facets of entertainment. Twin Peaks, Phantoms, Pet Sematary, Vertigo. Somewhere within these original games are homages and nods to these pieces of work to show admiration to them, and developers have gone on the record stating specific inspirations. When it came to the original 4 games, the majority of inspiration were from countries and societies that the people of Team Silent had no experience of, so they wanted to depict them through a lens rooted in Japanese culture. Keep in mind, this was the late 90s and early 2000s. The internet was still a mere bud when it came to countries connecting and sharing. With that said, I'm gonna go out on a limb and claim that Team Silent were never really concerned with what fans loved in the previous Silent Hill games when it came to making 2, 3, and definitely not 4. All they cared about was crafting a unique and enjoyable horror experience for the player while building upon the town and history of Silent Hill. In the end, the biggest problem to me is that the Western developers weren't influenced by Western horror when it came to these games. Rather, they were most influenced by Silent Hill. After all, I can't find any explicitly stated inspirations when it came to the modern games that don't coincide with what inspired the original developers with the first 4 titles. But to be honest, I don't think the Western teams could have honed into that aspect the original developers used when it came to creating these games. Even Akira Yamaoka, the original series composer and producer, felt this way when reflecting on the first 4 games.
Even though we aimed to make an American-style horror with Silent Hill, I think there may be some part in the essence of our games that are really Japanese. It's not something we're doing consciously. I think what we naturally feel is fearful or scary is a little different. We might have a Japanese horror type that is very rooted in the culture, and perhaps Silent Hill is a mixture of this. We don't do this in a calculated manner.
This was long before any Western team even came out with a Silent Hill game, mind you. While there are moments in the original titles that can be compared to classic American horror, there's tons of ideas and concepts and occurrences that make the games unique to said horror, especially if you compare these to Resident Evil, another survival horror game created by an entirely Japanese team taking on a Western horror setting, where those games definitely tried much harder to replicate American horror with its heavy emphasis on violent combat, oversized beasts, and the act of blowing the goddamn zombies' heads off. Silent Hill went for subtler ideas that are more closely related to psychological horror. There were all these neat little ways to mess with the players, showing them things that are somewhat vague or giving them ideas to permeate doubt in their minds.
You come here and enjoy spilling their blood. And listening to them cry out. You feel excited when you step on them and snuff out their lives.
About the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Oh no.
Don't worry. It's just a joke.
You wouldn't catch Wesker asking this question. The point is, when it comes to the horror of the original Silent Hill games, I think an important component is growing up in Japanese culture in order to fully understand the mentality. I think another mistake these developers made were their attempts to replicate events or aspects from the old games. They feel like more than just homages. Hey, James received written messages from the town a couple times. Let's do that to Travis. Over and over again. Lisa bled out of her face in the first Silent Hill. Let's do that to her in Shattered Memories. Pyramid Head was seen allegedly abusing creatures in 2. Let's have Butcher do that blatantly in Origins. Heather went into a confessional and was asked to grant a person forgiveness for their sins. Let's make Alex do the exact same thing in Homecoming. The nurses were really scantily clad in Silent Hill 2. Let's make them even more lewd in Homecoming. Hey, Akira Yamaoka made incredibly unique compositions to build tension and drama for the original Silent Hill games. Let's make a radio guy play them in Downpour.
I don't know what you're talking about, but if there's a song you want to hear or a dedication you want to make, I could. You're listening to the DJ Rick Show on WLMN FM, where the tracks are tight and the sweet melodies flow on and on. It's always a perfect day with DJ Rick's your on-air friend to the end.
Look, man, I came through hell and high water.
What is this? What the fuck is this? Am I supposed to believe the background music from the original games physically exists in the world of Silent Hill now? Do they realize how this absolutely cheapens these original scores? I don't think Climax, Double Helix, nor Vatra realize how these are just poor, shallow attempts to imitate those moments or concepts from the old games. There's no real drive or spirit behind these endeavors to fillet fans of the original titles. They were too concerned with trying to make this like Silent Hill when that wasn't part of the equation for the original games. Despite being set around the same town, Silent Hill 1 through 4 have very little in common regarding atmosphere, presentation, or narrative. Team Silent just cared about providing an enjoyable experience through their own cultural perspective.
The original Silent Hill was our attempt at making classic American horror through a Japanese filter.
Of course, another big problem is incompetence in general. Many instances that show that the Western developers cutting corners, leave various glitches and bugs in the final product, and don't seem to care how annoying something like constant stuttering is when all you're doing is walking. Should I be surprised though? They couldn't even get it right with all the creative work done for them beforehand. There's also the poor writing and bad voice direction all around to take into account as well. Most of them just couldn't convince me that I should even care about their plights in the first place.
Daddy, this is insane. Time you faced up to what happened. Your mother and I will see you in heaven, son.
Where is everybody? Where's Josh?
likes collecting stuff, bits and pieces, bugs. She loves bugs.
Bugs? Like dirty, creepy bugs?
No, butterflies, pretty bugs. She has a collection.
Dead ones?
Yeah?
Still creepy.
Not really.
Charlie!
So obviously the lack of cultural aspect was just one of the numerous issues when it comes to these games. I know the whole thing is subjective though. In all seriousness, I understand there's a lot of people that like these newer games for all different kinds of reasons. And it'd be silly to say they're wrong for doing so. You'd think after so many years detached from these games, I'd find something, anything that hits me half as hard as the original titles. But alas, I did not. The biggest takeaway is that I have the least animosity for Origins because it seemed like the most earnest attempt to recreate the experience of the original 3 games, with its emphasis on trotting the town and witnessing detailed environments. It's basically the best I can expect from these later developers. Something else to consider when it comes to the cultural aspect, throughout the development of the original 4 games, team members fluctuated pretty often. Keiichiro Toyama, who was the writer and director of Silent Hill 1, left immediately after the game's production, leaving lowly programmers Masashi Tsubuyama and Hiroyuki Owaku to become director and writer of its sequel respectively. And there was even more shifting around when it came to the 3rd and 4th title, considering they started development of those games simultaneously. I think it's fair to say that Silent Hill 1 feels different from all the later games, and I'm sure fans are aware of the paradigm shift in tone and design when it came to the 4th title. Again, this game's production was without certain key members as well. Despite this, all 4 games have these strong similarities that keep them welded together. They all have this finely tuned sense of atmosphere, heavy artistry represented in the environments that can still put modern games to shame, and wonderfully written stories. That isn't to say they're perfect, but there's so many reasons to love these games despite their slight imperfections, right?
If you are attracted by some woman, she's not perfect. If you take her pictures, sometimes her face is like that. It's not perfect, but if always she's perfect, I guess you're in love with her because she's human. She has character. That character has bad point, of course bad point, and good point.
Just a few years ago, we almost got the ultimate test of this theory, whether or not culture is the significant divider when it comes to making Silent Hill games. We gotta talk about PT yet again, don't we? This will probably be the last time I ever bring it up, but I think it's important for the topic at hand. Teased as a new IP by an unknown company, hours later it was discovered that PT had the announcement to a new Silent Hill hidden away in the teaser's ending. You guys probably already know the story. Hideo Kojima set to direct a new Silent Hill title, got cancelled, left the company, yada yada yada. I was one of the many people on their PS4s in summer of 2014, having absolutely no idea what this was supposed to be or who's making it. All I knew while playing, I was scared. Maybe not scared the same way I was with the original Silent Hill titles, but I still found a lot of this to be pretty effective. I don't think it's fair to dismiss this as some cheap hallway jump scare simulator when it has plenty to offer, like the impeccable sound design and heavy oppressive atmosphere. I'll be upfront and say Kojima is far from a perfect game developer. I had a lot of major problems with Metal Gear Solid 4, 5, and Death Stranding's story was especially aggravating. Not that I want to get into that right now. I kind of understand people thinking this whole project could have been as faithful to Silent Hill as the last 5 titles. I don't like PT as a whole game, obviously. A $60 purchase full of things like this would get tired very quickly. But as a free, random downloadable piece, it's pretty wonderful. And what added to that was being there the moment it went up. I still remember that day, downloading the teaser, repeating the hallway over and over, grasping at straws, attempting to figure out what the hell this all means, writing down the foreign text that briefly pops on screen, going on forums to get them deciphered by people that understand the languages, discussing theories with others. It was such a magical few hours. But because the mystery lasted a small amount of time, this feels kind of for granted. I wish I can grab this moment back. I love how so many people were intertwined in this game's mystery, talking to each other for help to see if anyone can get even an inch closer to solving this. Working together around the world, developing connections with strangers in order to benefit each other. Kind of like Death Stranding. Huh. Anyway, this crew in Japan was able to captivate so many people around the world through, well, a tiny teaser that used the name Silent Hill. This was something that multiple Western teams couldn't even come close to doing. Not at this scale, not at this caliber. The people behind PT were able to get the entire world to pay attention to Silent Hill as a franchise, even for a brief moment. And they didn't charge you a dime. However, in 2020, looking at everything now, there's another side of this coin that really gets to me. This has become my newest concern regarding the potential of the franchise. It's a potential I'd prefer it just not exist, but if it's going to make noise, I guess I'll raise an ear to it. Rumors really started stomping around in January about Konami looking into developing multiple new Silent Hill games, and they fueled that fire by actually responding and saying things are being put into consideration. Also another movie by that shithead Christoph Gans for some reason. Seeing the feedback and responses broke my goddamn heart. I know I said Kojima and his crew got the entire world to pay attention to Silent Hill for a hot minute, and I was really excited about the potential of it back then. But now, I'm seeing repercussions to that. These people are acting like passionate fans while thinking he always handled the franchise or some shit. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It's hard to think about. In one fell swoop, Kojima inadvertently wiped away Team Silent's history. Look at this, even Google prioritizes him over the actual creator of Silent Hill. It was so crushing to see these kinds of comments. The words of Gaming Brit were just ringing through my head while looking at all this.
It feels like more people know that Kojima nearly made a Silent Hill game than the names of the people who started the whole thing.
And this is the most barefaced evidence of that. Imagine, if you will, Konami actually giving a shit. Just for a second, okay? What if they got key members of Team Silent back to make a new game? Takayoshi Sato, CGI animator and character designer of the first two games, has been working with Nintendo for nearly a decade, so he's still in the industry. Same for Masashi Tsubuyama, director of Silent Hill 2 and 4. Hiroyuki Owaku, the lead writer of Silent Hill 2 and 3, is still with Konami as a producer. Masahiro Ito, lead artist and monster designer for the first three games, is freelance but worked with Konami recently on Metal Gear Survive. He's also made statements that he's open to doing another game if he were requested. Keiichiro Toyama is still in the industry and is now working on Hotel Barcelona with Suda51 and Swery. He's still an active designer. Akira Yamaoka is probably doing his band or whatever, I don't know his availability. Would it be possible to get the entire crew to reunite? No, probably not, but the original Silent Hill games have such a significant history that if they got the call when the time was right, I think at least a handful of these key members would be happy to get back together again. Bands do this all the time. I'm not saying this has to happen, but it's the best case scenario that is considerably realistic. And assuming that were to happen, it pains me to see this get immediately rejected by so many people crying out bullshit like, it doesn't mean anything without Kojima, Silent Hill without Kojima is blasphemy, and a bunch of other nonsense showing they have no idea what they're talking about. Of course, not everyone was this idiotic when the news broke out, but the sensible ones were clearly in the minority when it came to these rumor mills and the response. The well of Silent Hill's potential has been absolutely poisoned. It's not Kojima's fault, really. A while back, he was assigned to work on a Silent Hill game and expressed interest long before leaving the company. Of course, using Silent Hill as a vehicle for this obscure diss track towards Konami and its exposure just mutated everyone's perception on what this franchise stood for. Nobody's talking about Toyama or Owaku, they're talking about Kojima and just him. Nobody's even talking about Pyramid Head anymore. They're talking about Lisa. Not that Lisa, this Lisa. People already had a hard time remembering the names of those that actually did make amazing Silent Hill games, so this really didn't do them any favors. Articles online talking about possible new Silent Hill titles use Norman Reedus' goddamn face for their headline. The uninitiated are gonna think that's Sam from Death Stranding. It's a really sad state of affairs to see how little these fans are interested in actually learning the names of those who are most responsible for creating such a fantastic quadrilogy of iconic survival horror games. Maybe I care too much, but it's tough not to. The original Silent Hill games provided probably the first examples of video game characters I deeply cared for and found their circumstances and acts of desperation believable. Even at a young age, the original team and their creative work got me to care about Harry doing everything he can to save his daughter, James following the alluring scent of his deceased wife, Heather digging into her personal history with the cult and seeking revenge, Henry's, I don't know, he kind of just falls into that whole mess with Walter's Nightmare World. These games affected me at a young age when I was still learning about myself and what I like from a gaming experience. So I can't help but keep them in my mind. Silent Hill is important to me. I'll always have the original 4 titles, and they'll continue to be wonderful pieces of amazing work in my heart. I just think if the handlers of the franchise insist that it remains relevant with new entries and interpretations, I'd prefer if they were actually both faithful and well done. It's at about the same level of importance to me as Contra with how it helped form my tastes at a young age. Both of these are Konami franchises. Boy, I bet on the wrong horses in this race. Anyway, that's my excuse for continuing to care about Silent Hill. There's other games, especially in the indie scene, that really try to follow in the footsteps of monumental franchises like it. I'll always give them the time of day and respect their efforts, and I always do my best to check them out. And of course, I take the time to experience the endeavors of those original devs still out there in the world. I bought Gravity Rush, I bought Nightcry. Still, that doesn't mean I can't hold out a ray of hope for the games I fell in love with in the first place. But I'll do my best to research before spending money frivolously on further Konami products. Thanks for watching. A big heartfelt shout out to the patrons that voted for this side project video. If you want to support my work and vote on what next upcoming side project will be, check out my Patreon page below. Speaking of, I'd like to introduce a new czar of Zombos who goes by Jim Ryu. JM Ryu? Jim Ryu. J for Justly, M for Magnificent, R for Ryu. I would also like to thank the friendly broski for lending his voice for this video.